Good morning, everyone. It's delightful to be in front of you all this morning, and I only wish it were in person. I'm Ann Edminster. I have a consulting practice called Design Avenues in Northern California, Sonoma County, and work with stakeholders around zero energy and zero emissions building, design, and construction all around the state and country. So I'll got a little talk for you this morning. Heading for zero, how much, how fast, and just plain how. So we'll walk through several topics, but before getting into the core content, just want to review what exactly we're talking about with zero net and what the heck is the E for anyway. It's a moving target. So depending on who you're talking to, it might be zero net electricity, zero net energy, zero net emissions. And as I said, it's a moving target, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the presentation. But to start with, the basic concept here applies across the board, so to all of these. Whichever we're talking about, the basic idea is we're reducing a building's energy demand through efficiency measures to the point where we can meet its annual energy needs with a renewable on-site system. So we could get into the weeds, but we won't. That's a whole other 1 hour talk. What I'm going to walk through this morning are some statistics about the growth in the residential ZE market. That's my cheater shorthand way of referring to the whole ball of wax, zero energy emissions and electricity. What's driving the growth in this market sector? Some fundamentals of how folks who are doing zero projects are getting there, and some insights into what is making these pioneering builders successful. And then some of the trends we're seeing on the horizon that are really going to shape this industry sector tremendously in the coming years. So moving right into the first section on growth and drivers. I've been helping run an inventory of residential zero energy projects across the US and Canada since 2015. And we've just completed our 5th inventory. And what you see here is a graph of the growth over those 5 years. And the taller blue bars, dark blue bars, are the number of housing units. So that includes both single family homes and multifamily units. The middle, the green bars, are the number of buildings. So if it's a multifamily building, however many units are in that. And then the turquoise, the smaller bars, are the number of projects. And as you can infer from this, that the projects typically have a pretty large number of units. So these are not just one-offs. And I think that's one of the first myths about zero energy projects is that, oh, that's kind of a specialized niche thing for the privileged. That's not the case at all. Before we get a little more into the nitty-gritty, I'll cover what we mean in Team Zero, which is part of EBA these days, EBA being the Energy and Environmental Building Association. We've teamed up with EBA in the last year or so, and we're now working with all shoulders to the same wheel, which is very exciting. At any rate, in the inventory, we include all of these things I'm showing here, which we consider to be in the realm of zero. So zero energy ready, and I'll define that. Zero energy net positive, so producing more energy than the project consumes. And we're also including projects in 4 different phases. So not just completed projects, but those that are under construction, in design, or in planning. Although we do exclude the planned projects from most of our stats and graphs, recognizing that those projects may or may not come to fruition at any predictable moment. And I've already mentioned that we include both single family and multifamily. We also include market rate and affordable. And in future inventories, we'll also be looking more at zero carbon, both embodied carbon and net operating carbon projects. So each year we look at more data points that are of interest to the community that's curious about how this sector is developing. So the first thing to note is our leadership profile. As Californians, I think most of us on this presentation are probably Californians. We can be proud that California has held the lead through all 5 years with the largest number of zero energy units, housing units. So these are unit numbers. And then the next highest rank of 1,000 to 4,999 units is represented by New York, Ontario, Colorado, and Arizona. And then we've got the dark blue, the 100 to 999s. And what's interesting about this is some of these leaders are in very, very tiny states with small populations. So that's also rather impressive. And then we have those who are coming along. And this is a breakdown of the top 10 by the numbers. And you can see that California is not only number one, but really head and shoulders above all the other states. Now, Ontario is quite interesting in as much as much lower population than either California or New York. And we have to move through this fairly quickly. So I imagine this presentation will be available. In fact, I know it will be available to you afterwards. So you'll get a chance to take a deeper dive into this information if you're interested. But what I'll point out now is that in London, Ontario, 1,900 of the 2,001 units that make Ontario the third largest state or province in the inventory are all in a single project that is under construction. It's the West 5 Phase 2 project by Sifton Properties. And this is actually fairly typical of many of the leading cities. So what we're showing here are top cities. So on the left, cities that have 400 or more units, and on the right, the next tranche with cities between 300 and 399 units. And in most of these cases, it is one or multiple large projects that are driving these numbers. As you can see from New York, the Sendero Verde project is about 650 units. That's only 1/3 of New York's number. The rest, the other 2/3, is also really dominated by a couple of other large projects. And then similarly in Davis, California, which is not a very big city, we have one project, the West Village by the University of California, which is a completed zero energy ready project. And that one represents the vast majority of the units in that town. And we could tell a similar story about many of these other cities. So I think that the real takeaway here is we really offer kudos to the developers of these projects, because it is their leadership in this industry that has the cities and the states really rise to the top in this. It's not really a contest, but it's always interesting to see who wants to know where we are in the rankings. This is starting to be a little bit of a heated contest, so that's pretty fun. Now, another notable finding that has been consistent, but really solidifying, I would say, over the 5-year span, is that multifamily, which started out at 50% of the units, really has established a very strong dominance in the zero energy sector. So going from 50 to 75% of units this year. And what we've also learned, we don't have complete stats on this just yet, but we do know anecdotally that a very, very large fraction of those multifamily units are also in affordable housing, which is exciting and really just destroys another myth, which is that this is about privilege. So we've learned that this is across all parts of the socioeconomic spectrum, all different housing types and projects of all different sizes. But notably, 90%, 95% of all the units are in projects of 2 or more units. So again, these are not just individual, let's say, passion projects. They are businesses that are driving this trend. Another trend that we're very pleased to see is that the performance is generally trending upwards. So the biggest wedge in this sort of donut pie is the yellow, and that's zero energy ready. This is our largest category, and it encompasses several different types of projects, which because there's a lot of variation in that theme, it's easier to group them together. So I'll say a little bit about that. They're projects that may have some on-site solar, or in some cases wind, but it's not enough to get them to net zero energy. They may be projects that are efficient enough that with the addition of a renewable energy system on site could achieve zero net energy. Or they may even be completed and have a large enough renewable energy system, whether photovoltaics or wind typically are the two options, but they don't yet have a year of operational data where they can confirm that they are zero energy. This is also a good opportunity to comment that all of the inventory data relies on self-reporting. So we don't go out and validate performance. We're not asking for utility bills. This is based on the honor system. But because the folks who work in this sector are largely doing it because they enjoy taking a leadership position and are really believers in how important this trend is, we have a pretty high level of confidence that we're not seeing a lot of made up information, shall we say. These are all people who are very proud of their projects and in many cases have created case studies or have data. We're just not necessarily asking for that for this particular purpose. The purpose of the inventory is really just to track the growth in this area and understand more about what's driving it and to see what kind of growth there is. So it's very exciting to see that in the 5 years, we've seen the net zero energy category move from representing only 9% with a few percent in the net producer category and the balance all in the net zero ready to where we have 39% now who are able to confirm zero energy in operations. Now you'll also notice that the dark blue wedge has shrunk a bit. That's the net producer category. I think what we're seeing there is probably more projects are getting to a closer goal of meeting their net zero energy and not so much overshooting it. Also, overshooting it is honestly not particularly desirable from an economic perspective because there's typically very little a return on the excess energy that goes to the grid. So people are getting more analytical and pragmatic about their goals here. Okay, so a little bit about the drivers here. And this is something that we've learned not really so much from the data, but from digging into the data and saying, what's happening here? And I've really already sort of alluded to that in pointing out the role of individual developers in creating the leadership patterns we're seeing. So if we start at the lower left here, what we see is that individual projects can inspire local communities. So one example is upstate New York, where we have one particular builder, Anthony Abbey, who's been a real pioneer in that area. And his success has really inspired a number of other builders in the area. We've also seen many examples where success in a local area ends up translating to a local policy or program that then promotes more activity in that area. And Boston, actually both Boston area and the entire state of Massachusetts are an excellent example there, where there was a developer early on, oh gosh, and I'm forgetting the name, it'll probably come back to me. At any rate, a local developer who started some things going, got some other local activists excited. they started to develop some local policies and programs. Those programs in turn inspired state policy. And then once you have state policy and programs, that begins to spawn more action in other locales, other jurisdictions. And then you start to see a real sort of mushrooming phenomenon. And again, Massachusetts has been a real stellar example of this, as of course, once again, my and many of your home state, California. So love to see that. Now, another thing to point out is this really is not an isolated phenomenon. We've got some of our sector media who are starting to look into this some more and telling us that the research that they're doing is showing that we are hitting critical mass with net zero energy buildings. And so the global market here is expected to be nearly $80 billion in the next 5 years. So that is a big uptick that we are expecting to see. And many thanks to Green Builder Media for doing the research on this. We're very excited at this prospect. Okay, so that's kind of how things are trending. Now let's look at what are the keys to the kingdom, if you will, the fundamentals that are helping the builders achieve this. And not to give you a spoiler alert or anything, but it's nothing terribly exotic. Honestly, efficiency, really fine-tuning and honing efficiency strategies is at the core of all of this work, starting with efficient form of an orientation. Oops, sorry, let's back up here, keep this on the screen for a second. And I'm just skimming through this really quickly. There's so much more that could be said, but I've got just a few key ideas to bring forth about each of several principles here. One about form is to start to understand early on a zero energy project. Again, remember, this is a balancing act between the demand consumption and, or rather the energy consumption and the energy production. So it's important to do some estimations early on, understanding what the energy consumption is likely to be, and then understanding how much roof space are we going to need for photovoltaics, that's the PV here on the screen, in order to achieve that target of getting to a net of zero between production and consumption annually. So we've got to understand this balance and what it represents in terms of the building form early on, and then also keep tabs on that as the building design progresses. So again, nothing terribly mysterious. This is just the numbers. Okay, our second fundamental piece here of the efficiency is the high performance enclosure, and the house wrapped in a cozy neck scarf, if you will, seasonally appropriate. And another tip here on this, when it comes to the enclosure, a big part of getting this done right is making sure that the construction documents, the CDs, really hold the builder team's feet to the fire in terms of the design intentions. And so particularly in California, where we have most of our population living in very benign climates, this doesn't sound hard, but can be more tricky than it might seem at first blush. So we haven't really perfected air sealing across the industry more broadly. So if we want a really bang up job with air sealing, we need to show and tell how that's going to be done. So including a cross section, showing how we have successful air sealing as we go through the transitions from different planes, wall plane to roof plane to foundation and so forth, and all of those transition details. We also need to include that information in the specs to detail the methods, the installation, and often performance testing and commissioning to ensure that all of the little 100 silver BBs that comprise the high performance enclosure and ensure its performance are executed as intended. Okay, our third efficiency fundamental is super efficient mechanical systems. And what we're finding increasingly is that as we get to a really high performance enclosure, interestingly enough, most of our natural gas systems are too large to effectively meet the small loads that we have with these highly efficient enclosures. So we're often looking at heat pumps. The heat pumps are not terribly mysterious or difficult, but we do find, particularly in the case of heat pump water heaters, which I'm mostly for the excuse of convenience, including in the mechanical systems item here, may need a little more space than conventional water heaters. It's also important that space is provided within the conditioned enclosure for mechanical system distribution systems. And so these are things that can easily be forgotten. And if left to the subs who are accustomed to more conventional systems, may not be executed at the level that we need, that is, efficiently enough to achieve the zero energy goals. So important to factor in those space considerations. Our fourth efficiency fundamental is what I'm referring to as best-in-class electric devices. And my tip here is, for a long time, Energy Star was really seen as the best in class. Well, even EPA a couple of years ago sort of acknowledged that Energy Star was no longer best in class. They did so by creating a new category called Energy Star Most Efficient. So EPA has those equipment listings, as does CEE1.org, that's the Consortium for Energy Efficiency, and Energy.com has a marketplace, which in many cases, the major utilities have branded under their own umbrella. So I know PG&E has this, I believe Southern California Edison does as well. So be sure and look in the utility websites for their equipment marketplace to find these efficient models. Okay, time for another sip here. So these four categories of efficiency combined get you to a home that is zero energy ready. So that is, if it's designed with this efficiency, built to meet that efficiency level, and commissioned to ensure the operation of the home in such a way that once a renewable energy system is added, it could achieve a zero net operating energy with that renewable energy system. And once we add the system, voila, we're at a zero energy home. And this is assuming, of course, my little footnote at the bottom, we're accounting for all fuels when we say zero net energy. If we're just zeroing out electricity, that's another E, that's zero net electricity. And if it is all clean renewable energy from the grid as well as on site, then you might be achieving zero net emissions. So here we are with our multiple definitions again. Okay, so whichever one it is you have achieved, let's learn a little bit from some of the builders who have been real pioneers in this field. And one of these, a personal hero of mine, is Gene Myers, who's the founder and CEO of Thrive Home Builders in the Metro Denver area. And I've heard so many wonderful stories from Gene about how he has achieved what he has. And he's been in the energy efficiency game for several decades. He's been an early adopter each time kind of a new notion of how to build a better house comes along. And this is one of Gene's many pearls of wisdom, but I love this. He says, you know, we have to understand what our buyers want, and what matters most to them is their family and keeping their family healthy and providing for them the best possible life. So he likes this message that they use in some of their advertising, a little baby in a high chair with the mom feeding her and the caption saying, "The air she breathes is just as important as the food she eats." So he's not saying come buy our zero energy home. What he's saying is we're building a healthy home. And so it also happens to be zero net energy home. But what he understands is the builders in his market, This is the most important value. Josh Salinger, who's the genius behind Bird's Mouth Construction in Portland area, has another message. And I think the thing to keep in mind, each of these builders is building zero energy homes, but what they're all saying is they've figured out how to make this business work for them and for their target markets. And those are in different locales, and they're not necessarily targeting the same type of buyers in all cases. So they've figured out what the unique combination of product and message is in each area. So Josh's message here is they're distinguishing themselves by offering comfort, performance, and quality at a close to cost parity with conventional homes. That's important in his market. For Anthony Abbey, who I've already mentioned, who's in the Woodstock area in New York, he says, you know, in my area, the climate message isn't important, the healthy message isn't even important, it's not even comfort. For our buyers, it's just about keeping the costs down, and that they realize that investing a little bit more for the solar and the efficiency measures is going to keep their costs down day in, day out from the time they buy and move in. Oh, wrong arrow. Okay, and now George Kurtzen, who's another hero of mine. He's in the Central Valley here in California. I've had the pleasure of working with George for several years on his project Habitat for Humanity. And I think important thing to remember here, Habitat's absolute bedrock is building the most cost-effective possible homes for the low-income buyers. And so what George is saying is, look, you know, we've invested more in some features, and that has enabled us to reduce costs on other aspects of the home, and we save money by building this way. And I'll actually cite a project where I was involved on the research team, where George tracked the additions and subtractions and found that through these trade-offs, and I will say George is an absolute genius at finding ways of shaving costs. They actually saved $3,000 on their first zero energy home prototype as compared to their pre-zero energy model. So that's quite an achievement, and especially in the affordable housing realm. Kudos to George. And then Brandon DeYoung, who's also in the California Central Valley, a bit south. He's in the Fresno area. George is in Stockton. Brandon's talking, really looking forward at going to all electric. So what he's saying here, and this quote is actually from a couple of years ago, in our Envision homes, the only gas will be for cooking. We have an induction option. Some are upgrading to that. And mostly importantly, it's just a matter of time and consumer education to get to all electric homes. And this is a theme you'll hear me say a little bit more about towards the end of the presentation. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're seeing with some of these emerging trends. First of all, I think no one, especially those of us in California and other parts of the wildfire-prone West, cannot fail to have noticed the accelerating concerns around climate change and the fires and the role of climate change in the much, much worsening wildfire situation here in the West. And the resounding message that we have a very narrow time window to address this, but the really exciting part for those of us who work in the building industry is we get to be part of the solution. So not only do buildings represent 40% of our global greenhouse gas emissions, but they can represent 40% of the solution. So as we replace the lost housing from the fires of the past few years and continue to build for our population that is growing and need homes, particularly in the affordable housing realm, we actually can produce housing that is not worsening that situation. So very, very important to recognize that it's not all bleak. We have a very hopeful opportunity in front of us. And as I mentioned or alluded to when speaking about Brandon DeYoung and the forward-thinking position that DeYoung Builders is taking, there is definitely a pretty amazing wave. I heard from a colleague recently who happened to be at Mavericks, for those of you who follow the surfing scene, at a big wave day where folks from all over the world came and surfed on these incredible 50, 60-foot swells. So we're approaching a swell like that with the decarbonization move. So as of this month, we've got 40 local governments just in California who have either incentivized or created mandates for all electric new residential construction. So those jurisdictions now represent over 4 million people, which is more than 10% of California's population. And we are seeing more and more of these adoptions in the local jurisdictions pretty much every week. So this is a very big thing that's happening. I know that for many folks, it's a little bit alarming and controversial. Nevertheless, whatever your feelings are about it, it is clear that this is the wave of the future. And so it's best, in my view, to be on the positive side of it and understanding the really terrific outcomes that come from it. So let's look at, a lot of this is driven by state climate goals, not just here, but as you saw in Massachusetts and many other states, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, so many. Hawaii is another big leader in policy realm, and Florida is even coming along. So there's a lot that's happening at state level. And here in California, as many of you are probably aware, before Governor Brown left office, he committed us to achieving a carbon neutral economy by 2045 at the latest. And I think it's important to emphasize this, at the latest, not the soonest. So we're setting a date certain for ourselves to achieve this ambitious goal, and we certainly would hope it comes sooner so that we can forestall more catastrophic climate events. So I'm looking into my crystal ball, and will offer some of my predictions about what we're going to see and what it's going to take to get us to that future, which is not so terribly far away. And I certainly hope I'm here to witness it. The first thing, again, no surprise at this point, considering what you've already heard me say, I believe we will see, and it's desirable to see, 100% electric new construction in the residential sector. So natural gas and propane, there's been very credible research done, funded by the state, to look at what is the opportunity to meet our energy needs with renewable natural gas. And what has been determined is that we will have some supply, but is not nearly enough to serve all the uses that are currently using natural gas. And therefore, these gases are going to be limited to those few applications that are hard to electrify. So we need to reserve those resources for those types of uses. So we're going to see more renewable energy. Even though the current Title 24 Energy Code actually puts sort of a lid on the amount of renewable energy on new homes, that is mostly driven by the desire to have a better match between demand and supply, so that we don't end up with a big oversupply of renewable energy at times of day when we don't have anywhere to put it. So when the sun is high in the sky and we have a lot of renewable energy production from the photovoltaics we have across the state, right now we're not always able to use it all. However, the other thing that's happening is we're going to see more on-site energy storage, and of course the state and beyond. There are also very significant efforts to increase utility scale energy storage. So we're going to start to see a bit better balance between those two, and including more and more batteries on homes. And I imagine we may even have some listeners today who are starting to look at energy storage on site themselves, not least of all because of the public safety power shutoffs many of us have experienced. And I know with people both working and schooling at home, maintaining electricity supply on their home premises is just tremendously important. And so this is really trended upwards for, I've spoken with some of the photovoltaic vendors, and they have said that a large fraction of their new contracts to install solar are including on-site battery storage. So that is already happening. And you'll see I've shown an electric vehicle in this image as well. And what this is representing is there's more and more interest also in using electric vehicles as a battery storage strategy at the home. Sorry, I'm getting a little croaky here. Now, right now, there are some folks who are doing that, using their electric vehicles as a battery, but it's mostly kind of a bootstrap operation at this point. What we are hearing, though, in the industry is that there are some technologies that are on the horizon that are going to make that much easier to implement. And so I think we're going to see it much more widespread over the next several years. So we're going to see, again, just to recap, battery storage or energy storage at utility scale to help balance the supply of more renewable energy, which we also need to get to the state's energy goals. And we're going to see two different forms, at least two different forms, and actually probably three forms of energy storage on site at our homes. And that's batteries, its use of hot water for thermal storage, and use of electric vehicles. So stay tuned. These are going to be interesting developments. And then the third component of making this whole what's called time of use equation work is demand response. And there's also a lot of effort going into this right now in the research realm, research and development, is developing the controls that will enable the grid to talk to all of these distributed energy resources, which is how we refer to photovoltaics that are behind the meter at our homes, and batteries and vehicles and other electric devices. So many newer, EV chargers have some demand response capability, and even household appliances. So dishwashers, clothes washers, dryers, other certainly heating and cooling systems. Demand response has been talked about for quite a long time. I first learned something about it probably upwards of a decade ago. And at that time, when I first started researching it, I would ask people, so tell me about demand response, what is that? And it was honestly mostly a lot of concept and hand waving at that point. And we are starting to see demand response materialize in certain ways. I know, for example, as I mentioned, I live in Sonoma County, and Sonoma Clean Power, which is our community choice aggregator up here, has a program called Grid Savvy, which does enable charging your electric vehicle at the best time for the grid. So without direct human intervention. So that can be set up to happen automatically. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of what we're going to see in years to come. And I think it's all, I guess the other thing to say is I really expect all of this to snowball quite rapidly. We're at the very, very beginning of some of these things taking off. And my guess is by the end of 2021, we're going to see significant uptick. By the end of 2022, a lot of these things are going to be really just widespread and commonly accepted. Now, the other part of this, which doesn't affect so much affect new construction or builders who are involved in new construction. But I think a very, very big piece of what we're going to see in the housing industry more broadly is a really extensive effort to both improve the efficiency of and electrify our existing home stock. Because of course this represents most of the homes we have in the state and elsewhere. And right now we need to see improvements across the board. But something that will affect both the new construction and the existing, I think, is going to be the creation of community microgrids. So, and this has to do with both climate goals and perhaps more importantly, resiliency. And harkening back again to the public safety power shutoffs, one of the things that we've certainly learned with those shutoffs is they are a fairly crude instrument at this point. So large areas are taken out. When we've had these fires, large areas have had to be taken down because we don't have a more sophisticated system. So there's a lot of effort right now is going into figuring out how do we break down our monolithic grid into smaller increments that can more dynamically respond to changes in demand and supply, and also resiliency challenges, such as the need to sometimes shut off areas in response to fire or other disasters. So this is another thing that is really in a very nascent stage right now. Most of the microgrids are at a pretty small scale and relatively early stage demonstrations, but I think we're going to see much more operational community scale microgrids starting to take shape in the communities around us in the next 2 to 3 years. This is another thing I expect to see advance tremendously. And the way this will affect new construction, I believe, is we're going to very shortly see the emergence of the inclusion of a microgrid ready type specification for new home construction. So we're going to be anticipating what type of, again, demand response and other controls are we going to need to incorporate in new construction in order to be ready once we are able to implement community scale microgrids in a more widespread way. Whew, so deep breath here. I'll wet my whistle. And we will conclude here. So I have a couple of resources I'm showing on the screen, and with hot links that will show up if you have access to the slide deck after this. I know PCBC is planning to have this available for broadcast later, but if for some reason these links are not available, all of you are certainly welcome to email me. You can find a contact form on my website, which is on the screen here, edminster.com. So what I'll say a little bit about these two resources. On the left is a zero net energy primer that I wrote for the American Institute of Architects California Council a couple of years back. And on the right, a sort of a companion document, but that was created for PG&E and its Zero Net Energy Builder pilot program. They're companions in the sense that PG&E also funded the project for AIA, so we can thank our public goods funds that the Public Utilities Commission has PG&E collect on behalf of those of us who are in the territory and then utilize to create resources like this. The notable thing about both of these, so on the left primarily focusing on the design side and on the right primarily focusing on the construction side, the Zero Net Energy Builder Resource Guide I wrote in collaboration with my colleague Rick Chitwood, who is really quite an innovator and a pioneer, particularly in HVAC, has been really instrumental in moving ahead the state of practice in California. And I'm happy for Rick and sad for me and the rest of my colleagues to say that Rick retired earlier this year. So I'm glad we have this document which embodies a lot of the wisdom and knowledge and I think lessons learned that Rick accumulated over the years. Both of these documents have within them their PDF downloads, both available for free, and they both have hundreds of other hot links to additional resources on any sort of granular topic related to achieving zero net energy, electricity, or emissions. Take your pick. That you might want to delve into. So whether it's how to install exterior continuous insulation, or what type of window properties you might want to consider, what type of air sealing protocols, what are suitable zero energy target metrics for HVAC performance. All of that type of information is embedded in these documents. And again, with layers and layers of additional information. So they're both short and I think quite accessible, but chock-a-block with more information. So with that, I can close down my slide deck and share my face with you all again and take a look at what we might have in the chat box. So let us see. Okay, here's a question. Do you think the cost of a battery can be offset in terms of keeping homeowners out of higher price tiers in the summer? That's a great question. And honestly, I don't feel we have a definitive answer to that one yet. When the state did the research to create the latest version of the Energy Code, Title 24, 2019, they looked pretty seriously at batteries and determined that they are not yet cost effective in the way the state requires that new measures be cost effective if they are going to be mandated as part of Title 24. So, however, my general sense is that there probably are circumstances where it is going to be cost effective to have batteries. And then, of course, I think the other thing to factor into that answer is that for those who absolutely cannot afford to lose power in their homes because of what's going on in the home in terms of work and schooling, there's also sort of a non-monetary cost associated with this too. So I think what we're seeing right now is a lot of people making an individual decision that a battery may not necessarily pay for itself in monetary terms, but it's important to them to have it. And of course, you know, many decisions folks make around their homes fall into that category. They're not all payback. Nobody ever asks what the payback is on a, you know, granite countertop, which looks beautiful and is extremely durable. So in that sense, it has a value that transcends its cost. Okay, let's see what else we have here. A question from YouTube. What does a microgrid ready spec include? That's another great question, and I cannot fully answer that because it's a moving target. There are some folks who've been working on microgrid ready specs. I believe a draft is available possibly through the Clean Coalition, which is a nonprofit organization. If you do not find it there, you could certainly email me and I can see if I can run down whatever is the most current version of that. A lot of it has to do with ensuring adequate electrical capacity in the panel. And yeah, there's more to it than that, but it's been a while since I've looked at a version, so I'm not gonna punt on that. Okay, let's see. Next question. Are there zero energy projects in design that never get completed? What's the biggest roadblock? There are, and honestly, I'm not quite sure. The largest one I'm aware of was a project in Sacramento that was in the inventory a few years back and then was retracted, and I never did get the story. I suspect it's like so many other projects that don't materialize, that it's probably things get hung up in entitlement. But mostly what we're seeing is things go, one of the things we have in our data intake form on the web for Team Zero is for those who have reported projects in prior year's inventory, they can update us on the status of their project. And so we do see projects move typically from being in design or in construction to being completed. So we have the ability to track that to some extent, although we haven't. That's not one of the stats we've reported on yet, but I'm not aware of very many projects where that is happening. Okay, another question. What new storage tech are you talking about? Well, the new storage tech isn't so much the technology as it is deployment. So again, utility scale storage, energy storage. I don't honestly know what that looks like. The world of the grid is interesting to me, but I can't say I'm deeply technically knowledgeable there. And in terms of homes, more batteries. You know, we know what those batteries look like, and we're seeing them getting more and more popular, and new brands come out, and then vehicles. So that's all I really have to say about that. Okay, let's see what types of air sealing requirements in the CDs help prevent installation mishaps. So there can be quite a lot of information. In fact, there is extensive information on air sealing protocols in the ZeroNet Energy Builder Resource Guide that I would direct you to rather than attempting to capture that. But again, as I mentioned during the presentation time, showing the details, how things happen at transitions. So for example, at a window opening, at a door opening, when you transition from the wall plane up to the roof, how do you air seal at the eaves, for example? Lots of information about how to deal with that, showing the continuity of the air barriers, as well as guidance on types of materials and application methods. Okay, another question. Do you think future climate events will impact a zero energy home's ability to remain as zero energy? That is, having consumption equal production. That is a great question. Certainly with increasing temperature extremes, I think it's possible that if homes are designed to meet, let's say, a given cooling load, and we have more hotter weather, it's possible that we can get outside the comfort range for a home as the planet heats up. And the best hedge against that, of course, is kind of taking more of a, maybe not a worst case assumption, but assuming when we look at our projections for cooling needs, that they will be on the low side if we're looking at cooling degree days based on historical averages, that those averages are going to be climbing over time. So, and this is certainly a concern for those who are looking at energy models and like what are the data sets we're using and how reliable are they? So I think it's good to, let's say, err on the side of caution to some extent, not to extremes, because of course we know that if we oversize our mechanical systems, they actually provide less comfort and will wear out prematurely through too rapid cycling. So it's trying to find that sweet spot. Okay, let's see. Why are we not seeing more solar roof tiles in America? Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think one thing to think about is even let's say a nominal 25-year comp shingle roof may considerably outlive that 25 years in relatively benign conditions, or if somebody's not too concerned about the occasional minor leak. PVs, on the other hand, have a, also of say a 25-year lifespan is what's to be anticipated. And if you were to say, well, my roof is going to stop producing energy, the roof that provides protection from the weather and gives me my energy source, all of that is going to start degrading in 25 years. That's not so appealing in terms of replacement. On the other hand, you can put a 30, 40, 50, 100-year roof on your house, and if you're putting conventional PVs on top of that and they wear out in a shorter period of time, it's pretty easy to remove and replace with a new energy system. So I think that the solar roof tiles are a great idea in concept, but in practice, they may represent a mismatch between the anticipated lifespan of the roofing material per se and the energy production aspect of that roofing. So that's one thing. I also have a skepticism around the nature of the connectivity of tile to tile to tile to tile. That's hundreds and hundreds of connections over the space of a roof area, which is many, many, many more opportunities for those connections to experience challenges over the lifespan of the roof. So my caution says I would err on the side of durability and put on the most robust roof that I can afford, and then put the energy system on top of it, even though that's two systems, not one. Personally, I think I love the look of the Tesla roof tiles. I think they're fabulous. If Tesla can actually realize the promise of having the cost be competitive with the cost of the dual systems, and if they can really also deliver on the reliability and longevity, that could be brilliant. I'm just not feeling like we're quite there yet. I'm not ready to be a guinea pig myself. Okay, let's see. We have just time for maybe a couple more questions. Let's see. I think I'm in. Oh, how important is passive design in zero energy projects? So, well, passive design is interesting because it spans a concept that's, we'll say, 50 years old, from the early passive solar movement to current passive house movement as originated in Germany, albeit based on passive design principles that were really formulated here in the US. So we exported it and then imported it again. The basic idea of passive design in the sense of getting the building to do as much work as possible in a passive manner by the nature of the building itself, as opposed to with something that has to be powered to do its job, I think is absolutely sound. So we want to do as much with the enclosure as we can through good quantities and quality of installation of the insulation, through appropriate window selection, through appropriate shading, through appropriate use of thermal mass, appropriate cautious use of thermal mass, because thermal mass can be kind of tricky. The more we can do with all of those elements, the better off we are, because then if we experience power shut off and we lose our mechanical heating and cooling ventilation systems, we're going to stay much more comfortable, safe, and healthy for a longer period of time than if we rely more heavily on those mechanical systems. So I'm a huge proponent of using the passive strategies first and foremost and augmenting them with efficient powered technologies. In terms of the passive house toolbox, so to call it, per se, I think it's a really brilliant system of approaching developing really, really efficient homes. I think strict application of their numbers doesn't always work. One of the things that I learned pretty early on working with some of my passive house colleagues was that achieving passive house levels of air tightness in California, where our heating and cooling loads aren't necessarily terribly high, could cost an awful lot because the workforce didn't really have the skills and tools to implement air sealing at that level. That, you know, we simply didn't really know how to do it. We don't have a specific tradesperson under whose responsibility air sealing falls. We're still dealing with that challenge. And so what this means is achieving 0.6 air changes per hour is inordinately expensive. And we don't necessarily gain that much in terms of heating and cooling performance. So we find on a lot of zero energy projects that getting somewhere between 1 and 2 air changes per hour can really do the job and achieve zero energy level of efficiency. It's adequate and it's not nearly as hard. But again, at the level of principle, I'm all about the passive approach. Okay, I think we are at time. So thank you all very much.